And we ended the book, when we named the book always had this name, with the assumption that eventually there would be pushback, there would be some kind of backlash, because corporations know no limits. But the revolt was conjecture. And then on September 17th, Zuccotti Park arose, and we realized that that was the first massive signs of a rebellion. And so I live outside of New York, and I was actually in Immokalee when it began. And the day I came back, I went to Zuccotti, I spent significant amounts of time at Zuccotti with the Occupy movement. And Joe flew out from Portland, and the last chapter became Occupy. Because I think the feeling is that given the configurations of power, civil disobedience is all we have left. And appealing to the formal mechanisms of power is, in the political theater that's currently underway in the United States, is a waste of time. That elected officials are corporate employees. Of course, our judiciary is a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state. You can see that in Citizens United 2010, or the latest Supreme Court ruling that just battered public sector unions out of Florida. For me, one of the great sort of illustrations of the futility of the system is President Obama's health care bill. This bill was written by the Heritage Foundation. It was first put into practice in 2006 by then Governor Mitt Romney. It was 2,000 pages of it were then rewritten by the pharmaceutical and insurance industry to include $447 billion in subsidies for these industries, the equivalent of the bank bailout bill for these subsidies. When it passes, the first thing the Obama White House does is grant exemptions to these corporations because they don't want to insure chronically ill children, which in moral terms means that I live in a country where it is legally permissible for corporations to hold sick children hostage while their parents bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons and daughters. Co-payments and premiums can be jacked up. I have, because I don't work for an institution, I have to pay private health insurance, and it costs me $2,300 a month, and nobody in my family is sick. Now, if one of us got sick, they would just jack it through the roof so that we would become bankrupt. That's the world we live in. And they will push and push and push without, until we push back. The Occupy movement was a concerted effort to knock it off balance. It was knocked off balance. There were internal issues. We lost control of Zuccotti Park in November. Once individual tents went up, we were able to keep the drugs out. Until then, there were some sexual assaults. There were physical confrontations. Activists were staying up all night in de-escalation teams. The New York City police realized that they could essentially overload the camp by collecting homeless people with substance abuse issues, people with mental health problems, and dumping them on Zuccotti. When they would bring them to the camp and dump them on the camp. And so they lost control of the park at the end. Consensus, it's interesting that Kropotkin, the great anarchist, understood this a long time ago. He was an animal behaviorist first, before he became a political figure. And he studied tribal groups. He said that any time consensus worked, but once you got to the point of about 150, consensus broke down. He said why these groups often would separate, and a certain group would go off under another leader, or they were, because of disputes. And that's precisely what happened in Zuccotti. Consensus worked very well at the beginning when the numbers were small, and created paralysis, especially when you had a block. I'm not supposed to be following what happened in Zuccotti once you had 3,000 to 4,000 people.